We turn to Psalm 52, a psalm with a long title. The title says, "To the chief musician, a contemplation of David. When Doeg, the Edomite, went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech." And like in the preceding psalm, the title leaves no doubt what the situation is, what the reason is why David wrote this psalm. It's a contemplation, a maskil, and the events that it speaks about can be found in 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22. And it speaks here about how Doeg informed Saul about David's presence at the tabernacle and about the help he had received from the priests. Basically, Doeg is betraying him, is snitching on him with dire consequences. Not so much for David himself directly, but as we can read in 1 Samuel 22, verses 18 and 19, that is the result of this betrayal. It says there, "And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 85 persons that did wear linen ephod." That means 85 priests. "And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword." It was a mass murder, a bloodbath. And it's kind of surprising maybe that in this contemplation David thinks more about the root of Doeg's evil, his thoughts, his intentions, and not so much about the actual act of mass murder. But perhaps that makes more sense, because when you go to the root, you begin to understand why. And also David contemplates about how he, Doeg, will end. If we look at Doeg at the name, it comes from the root Doeg, which means be afraid, be careful, be sorrowful, take thought. And of course, we can say that those that had to face his sword would have been afraid. But more than that, it applies to himself, because judgment would be upon him. So the first half of the psalm describes the sin, more maybe even the root of the sin. And then the second half speaks about the response to it. So verses 1 through 4. "Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs, like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue." David thinks here of the report that Doeg brought to King Saul regarding the whereabouts of David and the help he got from the priests. And he did not only think of the report of snitching itself, but also of the joy that Doeg took in boasting about it. And it seems there was some time between David's visit to the tabernacle and Doeg's report to the king. The Edomite had not just blurred out some information as soon as he could, but he knew he had a piece of valuable information, and he kept it to himself until the time it was most profitable for himself. A brutal mass murder, as we just read, would be the result of this report. The words led to a greater evil. And that is because the heart and the mind of Doeg were evil. His tongue was like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. The words were as much sharp as his sword. And it reminds us of certain events that we read in the book of Revelation, and maybe it's sort of foreshadowing that, where we see the beast in Revelation 13, where the beast has a mouth of blasphemy. He speaks great blasphemy. It begins with words, but then it says, him was given the power to overcome the saints. That is what we see here, the saints being then the priests. He overcame them, he killed them by the edge of the sword. But we see eventually that in the book of Revelation that he himself will come to his end, and all those that took his side, they were also destroyed by the sword that proceeded out of the mouth of Jesus. A sword of words that are destructive. It's remarkable that David focuses mainly on the words of Doeg. But David understood the source of the deeds. And by saying, you loved evil more than good, and lying rather than speaking righteousness, David was directly addressing Doeg's wicked heart and mind. And one has to think of James' description of the power of the tongue. In James 3 verse 8 he writes, "But the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison." And that is what we deal with, and that is how it began in any case. But it leads to worse. So it's actually apropos that David addresses that first, or first and foremost even. David calls Doeg a mighty man, and it's obvious that is meant ironically. Killing 85 priests who are not trained for the battle and who are unarmed. It says they were wearing linen, they were in their garments. Doing such a deed is not really the work of a mighty man. And we can see, of course, if you read this chapter, 1 Samuel 22, that Saul first commands his soldiers to fall on the priests, but they don't do it. They know that this is not honorable; it's wrong. It's wrong, and that's when Doeg does it himself. And this so-called mighty man, on top of that, killed the women, children, and animals of the village of Nob. So nothing honorable about him, not at all a mighty man. David knew, however, that Doeg's evil way would eventually fail. God's goodness would outlast his evil. The goodness of God endures forever, he says in verse 1. So what is following now is David prophesying basically the judgment of God against Doeg. So this is now the second half of the psalm where we see the response. The response from God, from heaven, the response from others, and the response of David. Verse 5. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away, and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place, and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. Because God's goodness endures continually, Doeg and his kind would be destroyed forever. God will not allow this kind of destruction to continue always. And David mentions 4 images of judgment. First of all, he says the wicked will be destroyed. Now, that's clear. Then he says the wicked will be taken away. Literally, the word is to be snatched up like coal from a fire. It will happen fast. And the wicked will lose their dwelling place, it says. May it be palaces or fortresses, it will not help them. And lastly, the wicked will be uprooted like a tree out of the land of the living. In other words, to be dead, to die. Clearly, Doeg was destined for death. And the image of being plucked up from the roots implies a violent death. It is a terrible destiny of the sinner who has all his portion in this world. Then he continues with the response of others in verse 6 and 7. The righteous also shall see, and fear, and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. So we just read of God's response to Doeg's wickedness. Here we see how God's people, the righteous, respond. They will notice the judgment against Doeg, and they will in return honor and reverence God. They will even laugh, not with righteous joy, but with humble scorn. They will say, here is the man who did not make God his strength. Doeg's destructive and deceitful words, his bloody and murderous actions, they were the result of him not trusting God. Instead, he trusted the abundance of his riches, it says here. And that's an interesting remark. It implies that Doeg, in return of his snitching, received riches, and that would even be his motive. He had withheld valuable information until the moment it was most profitable for him. He murdered 85 priests and all the inhabitants of their city, Nob, to gain great favor of Saul. And the favor of the king could be a path to great riches. That is what he had in mind. Wealth and wickedness are bad companions. And when combined, they make a monster. And that is something to think about if we look at many of the leaders today, both in the West, in the Far East, in the Middle East. We see often a combination of wealth and wickedness. We can also take as an example Judas, who was also in it for the money. In the end, he realized that the money did not bring him happiness or joy at all. It was all was to his own detriment. But it was his motivation. And of course, at the backdrop of all this, we can also think about what all this says about Saul, because he commanded this murder. He was the one who incited the whole thing. Not good at all, to say the least. But it shows often that's what kings do. They don't dirty their own hands, they have others do it for them. But that doesn't make them less guilty. And it's tragic that only the righteous learn from Doeg's judgment. One would wish it were the wicked that would learn from this. But the irony of life is that the teachings of life are appreciated most by those who have already learned them. And those who need them most, they think of them least. Then we have the response of David to this in verse 8 and 9. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever, because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. This is David's personal response. He stays close to God. He draws even nearer to God. He trusts and praises God. He waits for Him, because it is good. He compares himself to an olive tree. And olive trees are one of the longest living trees. And he is a fruitful green tree growing in the garden of God's holy house. We can see the contrast here. He was in the house of God, but the wicked is in the world. He was fruitful. The wicked, they are barren. He was strengthened, settled, rooted, and they are uprooted. They are broken, destroyed. David was trusting in the mercy of God forever. Doeg was not trusting in God's strength, but in his riches, which would last only for a short season. And David knows this. He knows it by experience. God has done it. He performs. Isaiah writes it in a very powerful way, reflecting the words of God in Isaiah 46, verse 11b. Yeah, I have spoken it. I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it. I will also do it. And so it is no burden to wait on the Lord. His name is good in the presence of His saints. And this psalm really is something for us to think about today in the world that we live in, because we are in the midst of great evil and great violence. And the violence is against God's people, which are here in this psalm, or in this story, on which this psalm is contemplating. It are the priests. We see it happening every day. The persecution against God's people is greater now than it has ever been in history. And it will increase. But we can still be like a green olive tree in the house of God. We should not be dismayed, but trust in the mercy of God and praise Him forever. And we can do so even when we see the horrible outcome of the evil, betrayal and violence, because we know its source, and we know, more than that, its end. And so as we see the evil increase in the world, we know also that our redemption is nearing in a fast pace. We keep looking up, and it's good to think about, to read this psalm and think about how David looked at things after this horrible betrayal and following mass murder. Amen.